I still remember the morning of David's funeral as if it happened yesterday. Portland was wrapped in a gray stillness that day, the kind that seeps into your bones. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a damp chill in the air. Every sound felt muffled, as though even the city didn't want to disturb my grief. When I stepped out of the car at Greenwood Memorial Cemetery, holding a bouquet of white lilies, my hands trembled so much that a few petals fell to the ground. David and I had been married for 12 years. He wasn't just my husband. He was the person who had promised me forever, who held my hand when we signed the mortgage papers for our home on Hawthorne Street, who laughed as we painted the walls ourselves and argued over furniture placement. He was my partner, my safe place, and my best friend. Or so I thought. The crowd that had gathered at the funeral looked blurry through my tears. I recognized faces from his office, a few of our neighbors, and some of my old college friends who came just to support me. Everyone whispered the same words, such a tragedy, so sudden. He was so young. I nodded weakly each time, but my mind kept repeating one question. How could this happen so fast? According to the doctors, it was a sudden heart failure. No warning, no symptoms. He had been perfectly fine the evening before, sitting by the fireplace, sipping coffee, and telling me he was finalizing a big real estate deal in Seattle that would finally let us retire early. He even kissed my forehead before bed and said, "Evelyn, by this time next year, you'll be relaxing at the lake cabin, not working a day more." I never imagined those words would be his last. The funeral service passed like a fog. I barely remember the priest's words or the music playing softly in the background. All I remember is the cold weight of disbelief pressing on my chest. When they lowered the casket into the ground, my knees gave out. My friend Claire caught me before I fell, whispering, "You have to stay strong." But I wasn't strong. I felt hollow, like a part of me had been buried with him. When everyone finally left, I stayed. The caretaker, an elderly man named George, gave me a sympathetic nod before walking away to give me privacy. I stood there staring at the mound of fresh soil until the sky turned darker. My heart whispered prayers I didn't even understand. I spoke to him quietly, telling him how much I loved him, how lost I already felt. It didn't feel real. Nothing did. Back home, the silence was unbearable. Our two-story house on Hawthorne Street felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by memories. His shoes were still by the door. His coffee mug still sat on the counter, half full from that morning. I found myself touching his clothes in the closet, pressing them to my face just to smell him one more time. The air inside that house carried his scent, his laughter, his lies that I didn't yet know were lies. That night, I sat by the fireplace for hours, replaying our life together in my mind. I remembered the day we bought this house for $980,000. How proud he was, how he joked that we'd grow old here. I thought about our road trips to the Washington coast, the small lake cabin we owned in Tacoma that he said we'd fix up one day. I thought about the birthday dinners, the late-night talks about dreams, the way he always held my hand in public as if to say, "She's mine." But there were moments too, moments that I had brushed off back then. Like how he always took calls outside when he thought I was asleep. Or how he'd get defensive if I asked about his business trips to Seattle. He was in real estate, dealing with property investors, and I assumed his constant travel was part of it. Maybe I didn't want to see the truth. Maybe love blinded me so much that I refused to question the gaps. The clock ticked past midnight. I poured myself a glass of wine, even though I hadn't eaten all day. The glass slipped from my hand, shattering across the floor. I didn't even flinch. I was too numb. I curled up on the couch, staring at our wedding photo on the mantel. In it, David was smiling at me with eyes full of warmth, and I was looking at him like he was my whole world. I whispered to that photograph, "How am I supposed to live without you?" I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes again, the first light of dawn was peeking through the curtains. My body ached, and my heart felt heavier than before. But there was one thought I couldn't shake. I needed to see him again. Not in pictures. Not in memories. I needed to visit his grave one more time before reality set in completely. So I got dressed, picked up the bouquet of fresh lilies I'd bought the day before, and drove back to the cemetery. The streets were quiet, the city still half asleep. My breath fogged up the windshield as I whispered to myself, one last visit. I thought it would help me find peace, to say goodbye properly, to feel close to him. When I reached the gates of Greenwood Memorial, the air was eerily still. I parked near the same old oak tree I remembered from the funeral. The grass was wet from the night dew, soaking through my shoes as I walked toward the grave. The cemetery was empty, except for a distant figure near the gravesite. At first, I thought it was the caretaker again. But then the figure moved, and something about the posture, the walk, it made my heart stop. I told myself I was imagining things. That grief was making me see ghosts. But deep down, a strange, cold fear crawled up my spine. There was something familiar about that man's silhouette, something I couldn't ignore. I tightened my grip on the lilies and took a step closer. I didn't know then that the next few minutes would change my life forever. That I would come face to face with something impossible. That the man I had just buried wasn't gone at all. And that my love story was about to turn into a nightmare I could never have imagined. The next morning, the sky over Portland glowed with a soft golden light, the kind that usually makes the city look peaceful and alive. But to me, the world felt empty. My heart still ached from the funeral the day before, yet something deep inside pushed me to go back to visit David's grave one more time. I told myself it was for closure, but in truth, I didn't even know what I was looking for. Maybe I just wanted proof that he was really gone. I left home before sunrise. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes right before the world wakes up. The bouquet of lilies sat on the passenger seat beside me, their scent filling the car. As I turned into Greenwood Memorial Cemetery, a shiver ran down my spine. The morning air was cool, but that wasn't what made me tremble. It was the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. The caretaker, George, was by the tool shed near the entrance. He gave me a small nod when I waved, probably recognizing me from yesterday. I forced a weak smile and walked toward the section where David had been buried. The wet grass clung to my shoes, and the faint sound of birds echoed somewhere in the distance. As I turned the corner near the old oak tree, I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked once, twice, thinking my mind was playing tricks on me. But no, it was real. David was standing there. He was alive, breathing, laughing. My heart started pounding so hard it hurt. My eyes locked on him as he leaned casually against a gravestone, talking to another man. He wore his brown leather jacket, the same one I had seen in the coffin just 2 days ago. His hair was perfectly combed, his face relaxed. He didn't look like a man who had died. He looked like a man who had never been happier. At first, I couldn't move. My body went cold, my legs heavy as stone. I thought I must be losing my mind. Maybe grief had finally broken me. But then I heard his voice, clear, confident, unmistakable. "I taught my foolish wife a good lesson," he said with a smirk, his tone sharp and cruel. "She'll remember how great her husband's planning was. I'll make sure she never forgets." Every word stabbed through me like a knife. My hands began to shake. I could barely breathe. For a moment, I wanted to scream, but the shock held me frozen. I stepped forward, the grass crunching beneath my feet. And then he turned. Our eyes met. I'll never forget the look on his face, the mix of disbelief and fear. For a split second, he didn't move. Then, like a man caught in his own crime, he stumbled back. He muttered something to the man beside him and sprinted toward a black car parked near the cemetery gate. "David," I shouted, my voice echoing across the rows of graves. "Stop. You liar." He didn't look back. The car engine roared to life, and within seconds, he was gone. I stood there shaking, my breath coming in sharp gasps, trying to understand what I had just seen. The lilies slipped from my hands, scattering across the grass. The man who had been talking to him had already disappeared into the trees. I didn't chase him. Instead, I ran to the grave. The soil was still fresh, and the flowers from yesterday had already wilted. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stared down at the ground. Something inside me snapped. I dropped to my knees and started digging with my bare hands, tearing at the earth. The soil was cold and wet, getting under my nails, but I didn't care. I needed to see what, or who, was in that coffin.
Ma'am.
What are you doing? George's voice called out behind me as he rushed over. You can't do that. Please, I gasped, still clawing at the dirt. Just help me. I need to see. Please. He hesitated for a moment, then looked at my face, and must have seen the desperation in my eyes. With a sigh, he grabbed a shovel and began helping me. Together, we uncovered the coffin within minutes. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely lift the lid. When I finally pushed it open, my scream echoed through the still morning air. It wasn't David. Inside was a different man, a stranger. Older, with gray hair and rough hands. He was dressed in David's suit, but it wasn't him. My husband's coffin held someone else's body. George stumbled back, his face pale. Oh my God, he whispered. This isn't supposed to happen. I felt dizzy, the world spinning around me. He's alive, I whispered, my voice breaking. He's alive, and he faked everything. Pieces started falling into place in my mind. The closed casket, the rushed hospital paperwork, the way his so-called business partner, Eric, had insisted on handling all the details. The night before his death, David had asked me to sign a few routine documents related to our real estate business. I hadn't read them. I trusted him completely. Now I realized those weren't business papers. They were property transfers. He had stolen everything from me. I stumbled backward and sat on the cold grass, my head spinning. My husband hadn't died. He had staged his death to take our assets, to leave me with nothing. The man I had loved, the one I had cried for, had betrayed me in a way I could never have imagined. George called the police, but I barely heard him. My mind was lost somewhere between shock and fury. I thought about our $980,000 home, the savings in our joint account, and the lake cabin in Tacoma. Everything was under his control, and now it was all gone. When the officers arrived, I tried to explain, but the words came out broken. They looked at me with a mix of confusion and pity until George confirmed everything he had seen. They took my statement, promised to open an investigation, and told me to go home and rest. Rest? How could I rest knowing the man I buried was alive and laughing at me? I returned home that evening and collapsed on the couch, staring at the fireplace where David used to sit. My heart ached, but my mind burned with something stronger than pain. Determination. He thought I was weak. He thought I'd mourn and move on, never questioning anything. But he was wrong. I was going to find him. I was going to expose every lie he ever told. And when I did, the man who thought he'd buried his wife in grief would learn that he had just awakened someone far more dangerous. The hours after that horrifying discovery passed in a blur. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall, my mind racing in circles. The man I'd buried wasn't my husband. The man I'd mourned had staged his own death, robbed me, and vanished. Shock began to fade, replaced by something far stronger, anger. The kind of anger that sharpens your focus and clears the fog of grief. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the house made me flinch. Every memory of David now felt poisoned. I walked through each room, touching the walls, the furniture, the photographs, all the things we'd built together. They were now evidence, not memories. I pulled out our file cabinet in the study and started digging through old papers. Mortgage statements, business contracts, bank records. I noticed something odd. Transfers I didn't remember authorizing. Several large sums had been moved from our joint savings into an account I didn't recognize. At dawn, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for anyone to save me. I was going to find him myself. The next morning, I drove downtown to the Portland Police Bureau. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. The officer at the front desk looked at me like I was lost. "Ma'am," he said gently, "you're saying your husband, who was declared dead, is alive?" "Yes," I replied firmly. "And he's stolen everything I own." At first, they thought I was delusional, a grieving widow spinning wild stories. But then I handed them the folder I had brought. Inside were the forged property transfer papers with my forged signature, The bank statement showing $470,000 missing from our joint account, and a copy of David's death certificate issued just 3 days before his burial. The officer's expression changed. Within an hour, a detective named Laura Collins joined me in the interview room. She was sharp-eyed, calm, and confident, the kind of woman who made you feel like the truth would eventually find daylight. "Mrs. Miller," she said, flipping through the documents, "you're certain this isn't identity theft by someone else?" "I saw him with my own eyes," I said. He looked me straight in the face and ran. That seemed to convince her. Over the next few days, Laura and her team started digging. They confirmed that 2 weeks before his supposed death, David had sold our lake cabin in Tacoma for $620,000, without my knowledge. The deed carried my forged signature. The money from that sale was wired to an account belonging to someone named Daniel Harper. Laura leaned back in her chair as we went through the evidence. "That's your husband's handwriting," she said, pointing to the signature line. "He's good at this." "Too good," I replied bitterly. As the investigation unfolded, the scale of his deceit became clearer. David hadn't just faked his death. He had built an entire new identity. He had obtained a fake driver's license, set up business accounts under Harper Properties, and even transferred ownership of our home into his fake company's name. He had been planning this for months, maybe years. For days, I alternated between rage and heartbreak. I remembered the night before his so-called death. He'd made me sign a few routine business documents while we were having dinner. I hadn't even looked. "You trust me, don't you?" he'd said with that charming grin I'd always fallen for. And I had trusted him blindly. One evening, after another long meeting at the precinct, I sat alone in my car outside the police station, the city lights reflecting on the windshield. That's when I realized something. I had all of his old business emails stored on my laptop. He used to have them synced for convenience. Maybe there was something there. When I got home, I opened the laptop and searched through his inbox. Most of it was business-related, property deals, client contracts, but then I found a trail of messages from someone named Amanda S. They were flirtatious, full of private jokes and secret travel plans. One message caught my eye. "See you in San Francisco next week. Our new life begins then." My stomach dropped. That was it. I opened my calendar and realized the date matched the week after his funeral. He had fled Portland and gone to San Francisco. I called Detective Collins immediately. "I think I know where he is," I said. She listened carefully, then told me she'd alert the San Francisco authorities. But I couldn't wait. I needed to see him with my own eyes, to confront the man who had made a fool of me in front of the world. The next morning, I booked the first flight to San Francisco. I stayed in a small hotel near Union Square and began searching. I checked every address linked to Harper Properties, every transaction tied to that false identity. It took 2 days before I found something. A hotel reservation under the name Daniel Harper at the Regency Grand, a luxury hotel near Market Street. My heart pounded as I walked through the lobby. The marble floor gleamed under crystal chandeliers. People chatted over coffee and wine, unaware that the man I loved had buried a fake version of himself and stolen my life savings. And then I saw him. He was standing by the reception desk, smiling, holding hands with a young woman in a red dress. She couldn't have been older than 25. My hands clenched into fists. My legs moved before my mind did. "David," I shouted. He turned, and his face went pale. For a second, he froze. The girl beside him looked confused. Then, like a coward, he dropped her hand and bolted toward the exit. I chased him through the lobby, past startled guests and staff. He pushed through the revolving doors, sprinting down the street. I followed him, my heart hammering so hard I thought I'd collapse. But this time, I wasn't the grieving widow. I was the woman he underestimated. Just as he turned the corner, 2 police cars screeched to a stop in front of him. Detective Collins had arranged everything. The officers tackled him to the ground before he could escape. When they cuffed him, he looked up at me, eyes full of fury. "You'll regret this, Evelyn," he hissed. I stepped closer, my voice calm but sharp. "No, David." "You will." He tried to speak again, but I didn't give him the satisfaction. The officers pulled him up and led him to the car. I stood there in the middle of the street, shaking but finally free. For the first time since his death, I felt like I could breathe again. As the police car drove away, I looked at my reflection in a nearby window. The woman staring back at me wasn't broken anymore. She was stronger, colder, and ready for the next battle, because the real fight, the one for justice, was only beginning. The morning of the trial's opening felt like stepping into a storm I had waited months to face. Portland's courthouse loomed large against the cloudy sky, the marble steps wet from a drizzle. Reporters stood in clusters, cameras ready, shouting my name as I walked past. "Mrs. Miller, is it true your husband faked his death? Do you think justice will be served?" Their voices blended into meaningless noise. I didn't answer. I just held my head high and walked through the courthouse doors. Inside, the air was cold and heavy with tension. David sat at the defense table, dressed neatly in a navy suit, pretending to be calm. But when he turned and saw me, the mask slipped. His eyes hardened with the same arrogance I had seen 100 times before, the confidence of a man who always thought he could get away with anything. For a moment, I almost saw the husband I used to love. Then I remembered the grave, the forged documents, and the stranger buried under his name. That love was long dead. The prosecution began with the evidence Detective Collins and her team had gathered: bank records, property deeds, fake IDs, and travelogues that showed his movements after the funeral. Piece by piece, they built the story of a man who had destroyed everything sacred for greed. I took the stand on the second day. My hands shook slightly as I placed them on the Bible, but when I started speaking, my voice grew steady. I told the court about the night of his supposed heart failure, how his business partner Eric had handled everything, how I trusted him enough to sign whatever he put in front of me. I described finding him at the cemetery, alive and laughing. Gasps filled the room when I explained that the man buried in his coffin was a stranger. David's lawyer tried to twist everything, suggesting that I was emotionally unstable, that grief had clouded my judgment, that maybe I imagined seeing him alive. But when the surveillance footage from the San Francisco hotel lobby played on the screen, his defense collapsed. There he was, alive, walking hand in hand with another woman. The jury watched silently as the man who claimed to be dead smiled and ordered champagne at a 5-star hotel. For 4 months, I sat through every hearing. Each day revealed another layer of deceit. David had forged documents not only in my name, but also in the names of fake clients to move money. He had drained nearly all our accounts and sold assets to cover his own debts. He wasn't just a liar, he was a criminal mastermind who had almost gotten away with everything. But the truth has a way of finding daylight. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom fell silent. "Guilty," the judge said. "On all counts: fraud, identity theft, falsification of documents, and staging his own death." The gavel came down with a sound that felt like the end of a nightmare. David was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison without the possibility of early release. He turned toward me as they led him away. For the first time, his face wasn't smug, it was broken. "You ruined me," he said quietly. I looked straight at him and replied, "No, David. You ruined yourself." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed me again, their microphones like a field of spears. I stopped for a moment, feeling the weight of everything I'd survived. "I buried my husband once," I said softly, "but today, I buried the lie he built around me." Then I walked away. In the months that followed, I tried to rebuild my life piece by piece. With the help of a skilled attorney, I reclaimed ownership of my home and recovered most of the money he had stolen. The property firm he once ran, Harper Estates, was auctioned off by the court. I sold it, not for revenge, but for closure. From that money, I started something new, a small real estate consulting business aimed at helping women who had been financially manipulated or defrauded by partners. I wanted to turn my pain into purpose. The first few months were hard. Every letter from the court, every bill, every space in my house reminded me of what I had lost. But slowly, life began to return in small, gentle ways. Clients started trusting me. My name appeared on local business directories again, not as a victim, but as a professional woman who had rebuilt from the ashes. 2 years later, I bought a modest lakefront house near Tacoma, Washington. It wasn't as grand as the one David and I once shared, but it was mine, entirely mine. The backyard opened up to calm water, where ducks glided at sunrise. Some mornings, I sat on the deck with my coffee, watching the light spread across the surface, and realized I hadn't cried in months. Sometimes I still visit Greenwood Cemetery. The grave that once bore David's name now stood empty, the marker removed. Grass had grown over the spot, covering the dirt that once hid someone else's body. I didn't go there to grieve anymore. I went there to remind myself how far I'd come. One chilly afternoon, I met Detective Collins there by chance. She smiled warmly when she saw me. "You look good," she said. "I feel good," I replied. We talked for a while about how life had changed. She told me David was keeping to himself in prison, not causing trouble. "He's been writing letters," she said. "You don't have to read them, but we can forward them if you want." I shook my head. "No need. I've already heard everything he had to say." As she left, I stayed behind, standing under the old oak tree where I'd first seen him alive that morning. The air was cold but clean. The wind moved gently through the leaves, whispering against the stones. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, letting the silence fill me. That was the moment I realized something important. My story didn't end with betrayal. It began there. I had been stripped of everything: money, trust, love. But what I gained was far greater. I learned who I was when everything was taken away. I learned that strength isn't something you're born with. It's something you earn through pain, through truth, and through refusing to give up. Now, whenever I think about the woman I was on the day of that fake funeral, I feel a strange kind of gratitude. She was broken, yes, but she walked through fire and came out forged in steel. I no longer introduce myself as David's widow. I'm Evelyn Miller, the woman who buried deceit, uncovered truth, and rebuilt her life from the grave of a lie. And though the scars remain, they remind me of one thing. I survived a man's betrayal, but more importantly, I found myself beyond it. My story didn't end at the cemetery. It began there, on the morning I saw my dead husband laughing by his own grave. Because that was the day I stopped being the woman who loved him and became the woman who saved herself.